So now continuing on where we stopped in the previous video, where we were able to add new information to our database using the admin app. Now what I'd like to begin to add is to add some more web pages to this web application, meaning that this web application is going to be more sophisticated by maybe giving it the ability to click on a flight maybe and a few information about that flight. So what I'd like for this to show me that is the details of that flight on a page on its own. So let's say I go to here flight/1. I'd like to know the information about flight 1, which is from New York to London, and so on and so forth. So I can go to flight 2 and it would give me the information about flight 2. And now what I can do in order to do that is go back to urls.py and create a new path. So inside of my flights application, I'm going to open urls.py and I'm going to add a new path to my application. And as we said, that each model has, or each object model has a specific ID, and so we can refer to these flights, these flight 1, 2, 3, and 4 by making use of the ID. So this is the ID of flight 1, this is the ID of flight 2, and so on. So what we'd like to add here as a new parameter is the ID. And so in order to do that, we're going to be adding an integer variable. And the same way we've added a string variable previously, now we're going to be adding an integer variable. Let's call it flight ID comma, and now of course let's close that, and this is going to take us to the views that let's say flight function that we'll be creating in a second, and let's give it a name of flight. So, and of course I'll add a comma to separate the paths and save that. So now I've created a new path to my application. So this new path is any integer, and the integer I type in is going to be, we're going to be using in our flight function to get the ID. So now if I go to views.py and create that flight function, so flight, and so this flight function is going to take as a parameter the request and of course the ID that we entered as a URL. And so let's give it a name of ID. So flight ID, and it's the same name that we used in our path. And so now what this flight function is going to do, well, the first thing I need to do is actually get that flight. I can say something like flight equal to the flight model dot objects dot get, which is going to get only one object, and that object has the ID flight ID. And I could use a more generic variable called pk, and so pk is a shortcut for primary key, and so it's a much more generic way of referencing the primary key for whatever the primary key happens to be called. The primary key in this case is called ID. And so now we've got this flight that we want to get information about. And so now what I'm going to do is return render upon request an HTML page, and let's say that this HTML page is called flight.html, and I'm going to pass as an argument to this HTML this flight object. So in order to do that, let's just remove that, and I'm going to type in flight, and this flight is going to be that flight variable. So I'm going to save that, and now what we need to do is go to templates and create that flight.html. So create file flight.html, and of course go to the index.html. Is flight, so it's going to extend it or inherit everything we have in the layout.html, and now all we have to do is just add that body block. So block, and the name is body, and so now inside of that body, what we'd like to add is something like, so first we're going to be getting that flight ID. So I'm going to type in, let's say in heading 2 flight, and then inside of double query places flight.id, and so that flight right here is the parameter that we gave to this HTML page inside of use.py, which is right here, which is the flight object we got using that method. And now after I specify that flight ID, let's specify the destination, origin, and duration. So we can add an unordered list and add list item 1, which is the origin of that flight. And so in order to do that, origin is flight.origin. And now we add another list item, which is the duration. Sorry, first the destination and then lastly the duration. So destination is flight.destination. And you can notice that these are commands that we use inside of our Python shell, and we can also use them here inside of our HTML Django language. So the methods that are used on that model object can be used here. So flight.duration, and close that, and let's go ahead and save that. And now if I go ahead and load not flights, but let's say flights 1, you can see that now I'm returned with the information about flight number 1, and flight, let's say 2, gets me of course information about flight 2. And particularly for that flight, it's printing its origin, duration, and destination. And so what I can also do, keep that flights only for the index and not for the layout. And we can do that by just going to layout and remove that flights and just add it to my index and side of the body, of course. And now let's go ahead and save that and refresh that. And so now it's much prettier, much more organized. So now if I go ahead just to flights, I can see that flights is just specific to the index page, so the main page. So, and let's say I go to 4, this will give me information about flight number 4, which is here. Now there is some error checking that we probably should do here. Let's say I try to access a number of a flight that does not exist, so let's say 7. I'm going to get some sort of error that this does not exist. I might like to control what happens in that situation a little bit better, so you might imagine adding some additional error checking to handle those cases as well, but we'll leave it at this for now at the moment. So you can see how we added pages to this application and made use of those functions, that flight.origin, flight.destination, and all those that are variables that are inside of our model right here. in our HTML page in order to get information about that object. And so what I'm trying to say here is using those functions, flight.objects.get, we can get our model objects and put them inside of our HTML pages and make use of these information. We can just easily add them to our web pages.